Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion. My name is George Longwell, and I'm the Vice President of Engagement at the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Digital infrastructure is a fast-moving issue with big implications for people of all backgrounds. In today's conversation, we will learn how telecommunication leaders and experts are thinking about our society's evolving needs for digital access. This is just part of many conversations that we're having and plan to bring to our members in the Future of Work series, which will explore how the COVID-19 pandemic and other dynamics are changing the way we work, and by extension, how we live, learn, travel, shop, and play, not just this year, but into the future. We want to thank our series sponsors, Crown Castle, for their support in making this event possible and the entire series. And thank you to McKinsey and Company and APCO Worldwide as our series knowledge partners. Now, I'm very pleased to welcome our terrific guests this morning, and I'd like to introduce our presenter and moderator, Danielle Hinton, Associate Partner with McKinsey and Company. Welcome, Danielle. Danielle will provide some background to set the stage for our discussion and then facilitate a conversation with our panelists. Speaking of panelists, we have Jeff Hanna, Corporate Business Development and Strategy at Crown Castle, Evan Regan-Levine, Executive Vice President at JBG Smith, Wanda Gibson, Prince George's County Director and CIO Information and Technology. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we will address them at the end. And now I'll turn it over to Danielle. Thank you, Danielle.
Great, thank you so much, George. Thank you to everyone for joining this morning. Over the next 5 or so minutes, I will give a very brief overview of the topics we'll be discussing to really frame our conversation. And that will include 2 parts. The first part will focus on the technologies that will be focused on their impact and capabilities in the region. And the second will be on how we think about equity and the digital divide. Terrific. Can we go to the next slide, please? Great. So there are a variety of more advanced communication technologies that we think about typically on a spectrum, and each have a different value prop. Today we'll largely be focused on 5G, both low to mid band and high band, and the impact that these technologies will have on the workforce through the new use cases and services that they offer. Great. So 5G is the latest or the 5th generation cellular technology standard, which will bring considerably higher data rates, both mobile broadband and fixed broadband, or FWA. It will enable connections of 100 to 1,000 devices, which will enhance IoT applications and enable a variety of use cases. And it will offer a 10 to 15x reduction in latency, enabling a variety of remote control and automation use cases. There are multiple enablers that we think about when we think about 5G, many of which we will talk briefly about today. The first is spectrum, and I'm sure many of you have heard about some of the largest ISPs acquiring new spectrum either via acquisition or via the recent auctions, and the subsequent rollout of their networks that they have been publicizing. Second, from an infrastructure perspective, there's a huge dependency on fiber backhaul deployments, cell densification, and antenna deployments. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that is going in the region, again, in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. Terrific. When you hear leaders in industry talk about the impact of 5G, you'll typically hear kind of 2 categories in how that's described. So one, of course, is in the higher data rates that you will get on your cell phones or in any other devices that you're connecting to the cellular network. The second is typically around a variety of Internet of Things type use cases. There's several defined here on this slide. We will spend a bit of time talking, I think, more about some of the manufacturing use cases that are particularly relevant for the district. I'm sorry, for the region. We'll also talk a bit about smart city, connected health. These new use cases will actually create a variety of new types of jobs, new types of industries that will require new skills. And that brings us really to our second topic, which is around thinking about how we collectively enable social equity and driving inclusive growth. Next slide, please. Great. So the pandemic has shown a really bright light on essentially digital haves and digital have-nots. Through the pandemic, usage of the internet has skyrocketed. Many of the digital use cases that had started really have accelerated over the pandemic, just in terms of people using them to stay safe. In the DMV, there are at least 1.4 million households that do not have reliable access to high-speed internet and may lack the skills to use it. When we think about the digital divide, we think about it typically along these 4 dimensions. I think important to highlight that the digital divide is not just an infrastructure problem. That is, of course, often a fundamental problem depending on the geography. But there are also these 3 other dimensions that are really important to highlight, which actually also drive the economic value that can be created via digital technologies. So the first, of course, is infrastructure. The second is affordability of subscriptions, and this is around the economics of getting and staying online. Third is on having and being able to use internet-ready devices. So this includes smartphones, but goes up to laptops. And digital literacy is the 4th component that we typically talk about, where at kind of the base level, digital literacy is around having sort of just the fundamental skills to use the internet and keep yourself safe, and can go all the way up to digital skills that are needed to acquire better jobs. Next slide, please. Great, so many states are thinking about digital divide strategies and how to enable their residents. And really one of the key focuses has been on how to create conditions for the economic development that digital connectivity can fuel. There are 4 or 5 typical use cases that a lot of states are thinking about. So one, of course, is in increasing worker productivity, which can be just done through enhancing use of digital technology. Second is in sort of remote upskilling and reskilling. Through the pandemic, we of course had children across the nation learning remotely, but there are a lot of additional use cases that adults can use to educate themselves and to reskill. Increased real estate attractiveness is also certainly a feature of areas where you have digital technologies deployed. Another important one here not mentioned is e-health or remote health, which was also a use case that was heavily in use during the pandemic. So I'd like now to welcome the other panelists for the next part of our discussion. There are 3 people that I'll introduce. So first is Wanda Gibson. Wanda is the Chief Information Officer for Prince George's County, Maryland. Evan Regan-Levine is the Executive Vice President for JBH Smith's Investment Group and specializes in research and strategic innovation. And Jeff Hanna is a leader in Crown Castle's corporate strategy and business development team, where he is responsible for the program management of Crown Castle's smart community and infrastructure offering. Thanks so much to all of you for joining.
Glad to be here.
Terrific. Great. So I'd love to start off the conversation with maybe getting your thoughts on some of the key use cases that leverage advanced technologies, and also some of the ones that are most relevant for our region.
I can take that. In terms of kind of, applications that are using advanced technologies. I mean, first and foremost, what we're doing here, Zoom broadcast. I mean, the internet itself is an advanced technology that's seen a lot of growth in the last, decade, and it will continue to do so as technology just becomes an inherent part of our life, particularly connectivity. And, looking forward, I think that there's been a lot of learnings from this last 14 months with the pandemic, recognition that, video communications, access to internet really can maintain a level of livability that wasn't necessarily available due to quarantine. So, there's a lot of need to make sure that there's access to adequate broadband for all citizens and have digital equity, because there's the haves and have-nots when it comes to the internet, and those that are on the have-not side of things, really do struggle with kind of maintaining basic jobs. When you talk about just applying for, an entry-level position, most companies now have it online. So, internet access is essential to essentially, maintaining a life at this point.
Wonderful. We'd love to hear also maybe a little bit about maybe connected health or smart cities and the work that you have seen in the region connected to both of those.
Yeah. Anybody else wants to take that? Okay. Or I can chime in.
I can jump in on smart city. I think many folks have probably seen that, JBG just put out an announcement recently that we're partnering with AT&T to deploy 5G across national landing. And we think that we're really doing this because, just as Jeff said, we think connectivity has become absolutely essential to every facet of daily life. And we think that the fourth industrial revolution is really driven in so many ways by access to connectivity and the blending of the physical and the digital. And so when we think about the potential for what this represents, it's not just the hype and the excitement around 5G, it's the whole idea that connectivity needs to pervade every aspect of the urban environment and the urban experience. And for us, when we look at it, we're really saying that, for us to participate in harnessing this kind of growth and to see our portfolio filled by the best tenants who are doing the most innovative things, who are going to be, by virtue of that, the highest growth, as well as to be the destination for the talent those companies recruit, we need to have that connectivity. And we also need to have it on top of that, not just 5G, not just fiber, not just redundant, edge data centers that we're designing into the network. We also have to think about how do we leverage things like the $25 million of CBRS spectrum that we purchased in order to work with our municipal partners to do things like make sure the next generation of technology workers is trained, has access, as Jeff mentioned, to reliable internet at home, even in areas where legacy fiber providers don't serve those well, or where there's not great wireline connectivity. How do we leverage some of the investments we've made to do things beyond just serving kind of our current population and attracting new tenants into the market? Because we think that smart city in so many ways goes beyond just the notion of having these kind of parlor tricks, as we call them, parlor trick of counting pedestrians or saying, hey, this is when the next Uber is going to arrive. That's great. That's not a smart city. A smart city is about that blending of the physical and the digital. I'm sure later in the panel, we'll talk a lot more about what that experience looks like.
Danielle, this is Wanda. Just one thing in terms of connected health and why this is so important for government and what we are doing. Our health departments have all kind of innovative strategies in order to reach these populations who actually require care, and also to be interconnected with the hospitals, the clinics, and all of that, so that we have a holistic view of the health customer. And so it's important to us even recognizing that in some of our areas, some people just do not have access to the internet at all, which really would not make them as available to basically receive these resources. Also, it helps the government be able to do their job more efficiently with partnerships we already formed with the hospital systems, et cetera, et cetera. So this whole area of connected health is so critical to the government and what we do in terms of serving our population, which is extremely diverse.
Thank you so much, Wanda. Next question. How can we enable the innovation ecosystem and accessing and leveraging advanced technologies? And Evan, maybe I'll start with you on that question.
Thanks, Danielle. I think this is exactly what we've spent so much time working on, and that we've actually spent a lot of time with McKinsey trying to answer that question. And we looked at it as from the perspective, and I know you mentioned early when we went through the introductions that this is in so many ways, to George and Jack's point, as well as what we've heard from some of the members, this is a different, more diverse type of panel than is usually here to talk about things like 5G connectivity and the city of the future. And I think from our perspective as a real estate owner, we like to say that real estate houses the economy. And so for us, as we looked after bringing Amazon's second headquarters into the region, and after Virginia Tech's Innovation Campus was stood up as part of that sort of effort by the state to really transform this part of Northern Virginia into a true innovation district alongside Arlington County and Alexandria City, we really sat down and we said, what is it going to take to drive those new industries? What are the growth industries? And we looked at what areas we thought were industries that were high growth and that we had a right to win. What was really special about our region? And those were things like cybersecurity, cloud computing as the number one and number two effectively, but then followed by AI and IoT. And we really did a deep dive with leaders in each of those sectors who are driving that growth. And by the way, that growth lines up really well with what Amazon is putting in their second headquarters from a group perspective, where AWS has a major presence, Devices has a major presence, e-commerce has a presence, all of which touch those areas that we just talked about. We said, what do those leaders want? And we heard that the first thing they wanted was talent. And that's one that's obvious to everyone in the room. We hear that all the time. The second thing that they wanted was connectivity. They really wanted a robust suite of connectivity. And that's where we started understanding, well, what does that mean? Because when we came to it, we thought, well, that's table stakes. Everybody's got it. Everybody's got in a business environment, the internet connection they need. And we found out it was a lot more than that. And that's where we said, to enable that innovation ecosystem and to drive a living lab in our market, we said we have an opportunity where we're in front of regulators, we're next to massive customers in the form of Department of Defense, Amazon, major universities throughout the region, and we're in full visibility, again, of everyone who's going to make the rules around this technology. So what if we create a technology test bed that's going to look a lot like the next cities of the future, what everything will have? So we said we're going to start with redundant fiber. We're going to plug that fiber in, terminate it in edge data centers. We're going to drive off of the edge data centers. We're going to drive a robust 5G deployment, and we're going to own the CBRS spectrum, that mid-band spectrum that some share of 5G rides on. And so we've made investments throughout that stack, and we look at it from the perspective of being a digital enabler, a placemaker. We want to own the real estate, but opens up the possibility to deploy this kind of technology and to create that innovation ecosystem along with the major physical anchors that we have. But we don't want to be in the business of providing the service. We're not AT&T. AT&T is an amazing network partner. They're going to deploy it. We're not the data center partner that we're hoping to announce soon. We're not going to run the data centers, but we're creating the locations for it. We're convening the partners and working with groups like Board of Trade and others to bring together a diverse group of local stakeholders to say, hey, we're going to build this thing here in National Landing. We want this to be a place that's attractive to companies growing in those areas that we think we've got the right to win. Sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's kind of our basic thinking from the ground up.
Makes perfect sense. Wonderful. So Evan was touching on a little bit of our next question, but Jeff, I'd love to maybe pivot to you and ask, for the connected future we envision, what infrastructure should we be thinking about building right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think first and foremost, fiber optic networks. They're the foundation for all communications currently and going forward. After that, wireless. Wireless is essentially a short tail to fiber optic networks when you talk about the deployment. And so ability to get fiber optic networks deployed to newer markets at a lower cost and a faster time frame. New solutions like micro trenching, are really kind of speeding up that process for how to get fiber optic networks in the ground. And then after that, there's the wireless infrastructure, so towers, small cells, et cetera, to really support the mobile network operators and other kind of new operators and spectrum that's come available, such as CBRS that Evan was mentioning. That's really kind of important in terms of enabling all of the kind of solutions, whether it's low power IoT or high band millimeter wave 5G networks. Those kind of assets, fiber optics and various kind of wireless tower, small cell form factors are incredibly important. And I was also just thinking in terms of kind of what Evan was mentioning there. I mean, incredibly jealous when there's a kind of a developer that has this ability to kind of do something really cool and build a smart city and work with private industry and owns the land and the assets to do that. And I think when it comes to kind of making that more universal outside of kind of some place like National Landing, it's incredibly important to have the policies from the regulatory side of things that support that sort of growth of that infrastructure so that can become available through all communities.
Hey, Jeff, I just want to jump in really quickly on that, if it's okay, Danielle, because I think this is an interesting thing, and I'd actually put it to Wanda too, because I'd love to get her thoughts on this. That, we just announced this deal with Arlington County because, Jeff, we as a developer have the ability to build fiber cheaper and easier than anyone else, just because we own so much of that. We own, 2/3 of the developable land in National Landing. And so as we develop it and we repurpose it and we invest in this neighborhood, we have the ability to lay fiber really inexpensively. There are places where Arlington County had already invested in significant dark fiber assets. And so we actually went to the county with an unsolicited offer and we said, let's think about a really innovative public-private partnership. And we said, why don't we lease the conduit that you've already put in the ground that you built for economic development in order to spur the development of the smart city. We worked on all these restrictions and things that we would do around it to say, hey, this has got to be used for driving the innovation district. But we were able to put that together. And that deal was recently announced, last week, where we said, hey, we're doing this. We had it approved by the Arlington County Board unanimously. I'd love to hear, even Wanda, your thoughts, because this is something that I think is a prototype where we as a developer went to the county. We found a great mutually agreeable option here to deliver these kind of services to the residents and to build out the smart city. love to get your thoughts on how Prince George's is approaching stuff like that too. Sorry to take your role, Danielle. I just am like, so
Yeah, no, that was going to be my next question. Perfect.
Okay. Well, let me just say, and I'm so glad that that was brought up. First of all, one thing that the CIOs of this whole entire region, there's 25 of us, we have been working together since post 9/11 to basically tie together our own private fiber networks. All of the local governments in this region have fiber, and there is some extra fiber. And so what we did post 9/11 was tied all of this infrastructure together, and it was really targeted for first responders. So as they basically responded in mutual aid, the incidences wherever they would occur in this region, they had a private highway, a safe highway, in order for them to be able to communicate with all of the technologies that has come into play. We've got, of course, video is a very important component of that. All kind of data sharing, looking at maps of all kinds, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have actually been applauding that. And so I work with my colleague in Arlington County, Mr. Jack Belcher. He's been a member of the committee for years. I don't want to mention how many years Jack and I have served on this committee, but all of them participate. And so, yes, we all have, and we've all been looking at ways. So in Prince George's County, and by the way, I'm the chair of this committee. I've been the chair of the CIO's Committee for the National Capital Region since 2005. Okay, so I'll just say a little Maryland joke here, because of course, I'd be in the glue factory. But what we've been doing in Prince George's County is also looking at ways to leverage our fiber broadband networks, to which we have too, enabled by different means over the years. And we're looking to leverage that fiber. It interconnects all of our government properties. So if you just think about a geo footprint, our government properties and buildings are all over the county government footprint, serving libraries, police and fire stations, government buildings, schools, et cetera, et cetera. So our footprint is pretty wide with the actual fiber serving the government. So we were looking at strategies which we can leverage this fiber through public-private partnerships with firms that can actually kind of do that last mile, if you will. We would be the middle mile, if you kind of think about it in that way. So just about all the CIOs and their different respective jurisdictions in the DMV, we're looking at some of the same kinds of things. We're sharing best practices, ideas, partner ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And I did speak to this topic in Maryland, Association of Counties, but also the CIOs who have been talking continually in terms of how this works. Now, one thing I do want to say that the Amazon, landing in Arlington actually affects, all of the local governments in this area, to include Prince George's County's edge right up river, because there will be a lot of population coming in associated with working at Amazon that will be also in Prince George's County's footprint as well, right upriver. And I would dare to endeavor that the river probably would be a hub of transportation to get people down to Amazon downriver in Arlington County.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Wanda. There's a question that's come through via the chat that I also wanted to extend, I think maybe first to you, Wanda. In your role as CIO. So the question that's come through is, how do we link the smaller cities into these larger discussions regarding the development of smart cities?
Yes, and I'm glad this came up. Yes, Prince George's County is a government that's comprised of all of 27 communities, independent municipalities, to which there's conversations between county leadership with the elected officials, mayors, and administrators of these communities in terms of how to go forward, and also to explore what can be done from a larger initiative, if you will, to interconnect everybody. Now, Prince George's County also may be a little unique among some of the other larger counties in that we have both an urban presence, but we also have a very rural presence. So on the south side of the county, touching like Pax River and that side of the Potomac River, where those areas are underserved with respect to infrastructure based on today's model of industry, which is looking for density in order to justify their investments and going into certain areas. I would endeavor to say, wireless was mentioned, wireless is where it is. So basically, whether or not there's a house, or building somewhere, all of these other areas are used by people and businesses, and also opportunities for expanded economic development. So I look at the whole issue of the ecosystem of the technologies working together to get built out, because if we talk about where people live, work, and play, areas that are our parks and other kinds of resources that we are rich with in Prince George's County, where people go there, they need to be connected. And so that's what it's all about. So with the other communities, the CIOs committee I talked about also, there is a fiber, we call it the INET. There's an institutional network, a committee in Prince George's County with the participants from all of the municipal governments. And actually that committee has always been looking at, okay, what do we do next in terms of having a vital, vibrant underlay fiber infrastructure that actually supports the broadband, whether it's basically from an office, from a building, all the way to the wireless device.
Terrific, thank you so much. Wanted to follow up on a comment I think made earlier. I wanted to go a little bit deeper into sort of what does the future smart city look like? I think, Evan, it was a comment that you made. Wanda, I know that you have thoughts on this as well, just given your role. And Jeff, I know that we talked about this earlier this week, but we'll love to get a sense from you all on sort of the vision of the smart city. And then secondly, what does it take to get there? Like what is needed from industry? What is needed from government to actually make this a reality?
I can start, just from our experience. And I think smart city is probably one of the most overused and poorly understood terms that we have out there. And it's something that, look, has led to, I think, candidly, a lot of failure where people have tried to build smart cities without really knowing what they were going to do or why they were doing them, other than to say, well, this is going to have all this new technology in it. And that's something that when we started, we faced a lot of skepticism around, well, what is it that we're actually going to do? And I think that to answer that question the right way, I'd actually start with the back end of your question in terms of what do you need? And I think Wanda hit on a lot of this already. And Jack Belcher, I think, also was really thoughtful about this in Arlington County. But there's this notion that really to deploy the connectivity that you need. And I think there's a question that, I answered that came in, to me through the chat that was, I think, pretty interesting to say, well, what does connectivity mean? And the idea that connectivity is not just internet access. It actually means things like being able to get out to an edge data center where you have computing power that you need for really low latency applications, where you need to be able to have computing happening very close to where the business is happening. You need to be able to get to that without having it sent out to the cloud. It's an on-ramp to the cloud. You can use the power of all the cloud computing, but you have some of that compute happening close. And that's important for some of the applications we'll talk about in a second. The other big thing about connectivity beyond internet access is it gets to, and this is a big aspect of the smart city, it gets to device density. And so if you think about 5G, think about any of you who've ever been at a ball game and you're trying to make a call or send a text because you've just seen an awesome play, or you're trying to find your friends or post something on Instagram. That often doesn't work because the device density, it's ultimately too high. 4G, that standard doesn't support the massive device density. Now go beyond cell phones and think about everything in your house. And I look around, I'm sitting in my kitchen right now, everything I look around that's connected to the internet or could be connected to the internet, all of those devices, they're not out there so that I can go stream a video on them. They're out there so that they can do their job. And so when I think about a more connected environment, we talk about that. It means having a standard of technology that allows for more sensors, which do things like sustainability. They do things like public safety. Those are areas we're focused on and that we're spending some time on with Arlington County in particular. And you're also thinking about, obviously, this access to this computing close by. So it's not just faster, more reliable internet. It's all these things wrapped together. But what does that mean for a smart city and what do you need to do it? Well, to deploy these things, and Jeff knows all about this, you ultimately need, and this is where I think we've struggled, is historically you would need a macro cell site. You'd put a tower down somewhere that could serve a wider area, and that tower had to be served by fiber and power. Today, when you have to deploy for this new technology, more antennas in more places that don't reach as far, you need to ultimately have the ability to do that in a high density to enable things, especially like millimeter wave 5G, which is actually the 5G that everyone gets excited about. So you need a close cooperation between landowners and private groups. You need a cooperation between them and between government, because you're not going to get that density deployment without it. You need network partners like Crown Castle, like AT&T, like Verizon, like others. We're going to come in and help actually deploy the service and work with the carriers. It's more complicated than a lot of people think to get this going properly. It's not as simple as just hanging out a for lease sign on the side of your building and hoping you get an antenna on it. There's a lot of complication there. And it comes down to having the ability to bring all of these groups together and say, hey, we're going to actually make a concerted attempt to roll this out. We've been spending 18 months figuring out, where does the fiber go? How do we get the fiber? How do we prepare the small cell locations? How do we get those locations prepped just to get to the phase where we're delivering the initial connectivity, which includes fiber, edge data center, and small cells? You have to do all of that, and that requires an immense amount of cooperation. And smart cities typically fail when the groups behind them are only interested in either monetizing the sites alone, or they're interested in monetizing the data. And we're saying we're not monetizing the data, and to the extent we're monetizing the sites, it's part of our normal sort of real estate plan, but we're not holding out for high rates on that. We don't really, that's not the end of the day the goal. The goal for us is, how do we get the network deployed? Because we think the use cases that live on top of it, the what does the smart city do, And that's everything from providing just at a base, a more connected environment so people can have redundant, reliable connections to do things like we're doing today and expand into AR and VR. But it's also allowing enterprises to do things like have access to edge computing and to be able to go, have multiple fiber pathways in and out, or even to be able to do things like private networking and extend their own networks all across the sort of the cityscape so that you're living on your own private cellular network. These are the kinds of things we're developing with AT&T, but it comes back to also saying, hey, we're going to be in a position where we are enabling the physical experience. So you think of everything we've gone through with COVID, where we've blended the physical and the digital, and I'm sure Wanda can talk a lot about this and what happened in Prince George's County. Like what we've seen just in all of our daily lives is I'm using my phone to do more things. And we think that's going to continue post-pandemic. And there's going to be more sort of need to have everything connected in your digital daily experience. And how do you move through an environment with one credential, with just your phone? How do you do things like that that change that customer experience, that change payment, that change the way you live your life in that city? And I'm being very broad so that we don't suck up all the air on this thing, but there's so many use cases, but you have to get the foundation right. You have to get the connectivity right. You have to talk to someone like Jeff to get this thing built out, because if you don't, you're never going to be able to deploy all those things the right way to really build out the future and the promise of what smart city represents.
This is government right here. Government is in the palm of your hand. Actually, some years ago, some of us in the region had come up with that. This is the way that people, especially moving into this region or occupying this region, they want to work. This is how they work in their daily lives. Speaking of Amazon, okay, I mean, people know they can go in there, they can click, they can shop, and the next day or the same day, the goods are at their home. Maybe serviced by, an autonomous vehicle, a drone or whatnot. So we look at this whole thing as it's organic and it's happening. So I think sometimes when you talk about like how things may not work out when they get to be too complicated, that in itself could create issues where there's what I want to call, and I'm just tagging this right now, this is fill-in strategy. Think about us governments. Government has a lot of real estate. So there's a lot of opportunity. One of the things that we're doing here in Prince George's County is looking at partnering where we have real estate assets, where that might be a good location coming from like a carrier mindset, looking at how they're going to design their infrastructure to basically put a small cell, maybe a tower. And so we're getting ready to start an initiative to have a firm look at that opportunity with us to see what is feasible, what's viable, what is not. At the same time, we're also looking at the rural areas that are underserved so that we can actually look forward into things like the infrastructure grants and whatever that apparently will help fuel to get these fiber optics and aerial, and there are other means. It's not just going to be fiber, because quite honestly, and I was on a panel with the National Association of Counties, which was at the National Harbor 2 weeks ago, and communities are looking at all different ways to provide that broadband connectivity. May not just be fiber based on what the real estate is and other factors. So the government, we're here, and basically there's a lot of thinking kind of going on in these governments in terms of how we serve a population that, using my words, traverses this region all day long. There's over 6 million people, residents, businesses, visitors that are traversing this beltway, if you will, all day long in terms of where they live, work, and play, which may be in different places, notwithstanding the fact that whilst the education is in your particular jurisdictional footprint, but the people that support education and teach, they may be living in another side of the region. And so this is why this is basically a regional opportunity, a regional perspective, and then basically kind of looking at different kinds of opportunities in the different areas and how they fill in together is, I believe, how it's going to happen more organic.
Terrific. Jeff, I wonder if I could ask you, are there any places in the region where from your purview you see this going really well? We know that PG County is doing great things. Evan has also talked about the deployment, I think, in National Harbor, but are there other parts of the DMV where you see this rollout going well so far?
Yeah, I don't want to apologize for my dog whining in the background. Yeah, I mean, I think that, Prince George's County has definitely been a leader in this space. I mean, there's about 33 states in the US right now that have some sort of small cell ordinance. Maryland, unfortunately, isn't one of them, but PG County has stepped up to kind of enable the infrastructure that's needed for all this innovation to come forward and be rolled out. National Landing, National Harbor. I mean, those are areas that have and are becoming, big kind of innovation beds. You look at what's going on at National Harbor. I mean, that's an area that, you know, is rolling out autonomous bus systems, and, you know, there's innovation happening within that campus environment. Other areas I would say would be within the District of Columbia. You know, there's been a big initiative with rolling out Wi-Fi. Started out with some neighborhoods kind of north of Massachusetts Avenue. You know, it's expanding throughout the city, and that's actually been a big collaboration with Crown Castle, where we're co-hosting the access points for the Wi-Fi network. So that's a fantastic kind of public-private partnership example. But that's been, I'm sure, for the areas where that's been rolled out, it's been an essential tool for those, you know, within that digital divide, and able to access internet through Wi-Fi along those corridors, where the Office of Technology has been deploying these Wi-Fi access points.
Can I also just kind of add in, I would be remiss to not acknowledge some of the other work that's going on among my peers in the DMV. So for example, in the Mosaic Center area in Fairfax County, they basically kind of launched with a partnership that includes the electric utility and other businesses, a shuttle, a driverless shuttle that can take people around in the Mosaic Center and over to the Dunn-Loring Metro, for example. Montgomery County has a very mature initiative associated with broadband and connecting Montgomery County, for example. Of course, the District of Columbia, where there's been like 5G rollouts, especially down in the, I believe, the southwest areas, all these developing areas. Those are just some names. The City of Alexandria is basically embarking on an initiative to put a fiber optic network throughout areas of a City of Alexandria. So among the governments, there's a variety of different initiatives going on that basically kind of reach similar goals. But that's how we all have recognized we're going to be working in government. Government's going to go to process engineered, automated processes, and we're going to be using things like robotics technologies in some of the different agency areas to do some of the work. Drones are going to be very important for basically having a lower level kind of look in terms of a rooftop look in terms of what's going on. And so all of the communities are looking at that. Of course, there's regulations, could be federal, state, et cetera, that have to be addressed in terms of some of these kinds of things being become realized, but that's where worldwide society is going. And so government, we're headed in the same direction so we could serve our populations much more efficiently and make sure nobody is left behind.
Wonderful. That's a perfect segue into the next topic that I wanted to discuss. So obviously we're still in the recovery from the pandemic, but I think around the nation, cities, states, industry mobilized to really find new ways to support residents, to support, you know, the populace through the pandemic. I'd love if we could talk about maybe specific ways that we saw stakeholders mobilize to support DMV residents during the pandemic. And Wanda, I wonder if I could start with you on that question.
Yes. So in talking about kind of serving the residents in terms of like the government and whatnot. So obviously, as we're already marching forward with digital strategies so that we can be more efficient the way that people expect to do business with government. I mean, let's be real. I mean, who wants to basically kind of, you know, drive over to a government building and go in? People are doing multiple kind of things at the same time, as well as they're mobile. But we also had recognized what we were doing. We recognized that some people just don't have, you know, digital capabilities in their hands. So one of the things that we did with that respect is we worked very closely to put 311 on the ground. So, you know, a lot of people are used to 311, any government service. I'm dialing 311 and a response. But we also have gone out into neighborhoods, not only with 311, but also with healthcare and whatever more mobile units, go out into those communities and knock on doors even to make sure that people do have the services that they require. So it was like a multi-pronged strategy. I'm not sure, Danielle, if I kind of answered into your question, but we realized that everybody doesn't have access. And that's one of the things that is a goal for us, because we want to be sure that any programs that we do are not leaving someone behind. And so looking forward, and the county did have an initiative that included business. It was a very important initiative called County Forward. That's what it was known, what it was called. There was a report, and it kind of looked at this lens through the lens of education, through the lens of economic development, through the lens of healthcare, and also how the government itself is going to actually perform. We have to keep up with industry. We're in a region that is highly built out with all kinds of really great industry, IT industry and real estate industry and transportation. All of these things are here. So people that work in those industries and live in our communities, they want to basically be able to function just like they do from work and the assets and resources from work. I don't know if I got a little bit off your question.
Yeah, you did. That was perfect. Wonderful. So one question I wanted to pose to the group, and Jeff, maybe I'll start with you here. What do you see as the role of wireless networks in addressing social equity?
I think it's one of the most economical way to connect those within the digital divide, whether that's rural or within an urban setting. When you talk about kind of the economics of macro cells or macro sites, wide area coverage, not necessarily designed for high density of users. That's really where small cells come in. At this point, there's about 70% of small cells are within urban environments. There's a recent study that came out last month. There's a growing emphasis on small cells within more suburban areas. So I think what we're seeing is, wireless infrastructure, more high capacity wireless infrastructure is moving out into more of the suburban realm. Still need to kind of address more connectivity from those rural areas, but solutions like fixed wireless, having that fiber to the tower and then being able to kind of trunk that off into maybe a wireless internet service provider within a rural area. That those are ways that wireless can adequately address in a more economical way connectivity. And there's new wireless technologies that have, Evan mentioned earlier, the acquisition of their PALS license. CBRS though has 3 different tiers. There's a general assured access tier, and that's a license band or a band that can essentially be deployed to provide more LTE-like services in a much more economical and equitable fashion. So that's another solution that I think has kind of been exposed in the last year that could really have a big difference in terms of connectivity, because it's not just Wi-Fi, which has its range limitations. Hard to manage also compared to LTE. So the ability to deploy a CBRS network for K through 12 within rural environments. This is something actually Crown has done out in California. That has a tremendous impact in terms of providing that connectivity in the digital divide through a new wireless technology that provides a higher level of service.
I think it's so great what Crown Castle is talking about, because during the pandemic, devices got into the hands of students and all across this country. So the devices are there, but the access is not really there in all places. And so the student experience though may not just be somebody like anchored to like a one spot, like where there's wireless access. The learning experience could be out in the community, could be in various places where basically there's no connection available to them. And so the other piece though of this puzzle has to do with the in-building coverage, because I have to say there are plenty of older buildings around where basically, you can have the greatest device and you can have the greatest, you believe connection, but you get into an older architected building or whatever, and you just don't have anything. So another piece of this whole puzzle has to be the penetration into buildings, maybe getting into what the building of the future should look like. We talk about smart cities and all this. Okay, what about smart buildings? Because that's the way people are going to live. Everything in these buildings has got to be connected so people can work. And as a matter of fact, even the health and maintenance of a building and the items in the building is going to rely on being connected to the internet when people do actually go in buildings to do whatever. I'll have to say the biggest, most poignant case example of this were the freezers that were serving the vaccines. Okay, part of that whole puzzle was making sure that from a location, all these freezers could be managed remotely and making sure that they were doing their job. Okay, so I'm just kind of saying that beside the whole idea of the actual outside real estate or whatever, there's got to be some solutions for, how these big box buildings and all of that, that people are in all the time can facilitate the connection all the way to the device from wherever you are with your device.
Absolutely.
I'd say that's a layup for Evan to talk about what he's done with all his square footage of real estate. But I 100% agree. I mean, the majority of mobile traffic is generated indoors. Crown is also working with indoor CBRS deployments, obviously stadiums and venues, the 2% of commercial properties we're in, providing gas and small cell infrastructure to support those. But yeah, the in-building side of things is equally important, given that's where most of the mobile traffic is generated from.
It's funny. It's such a massive component of everything we're doing. And one, I'm so glad you brought it up. And for us, we've designed every new building that we're building in National Landing to be provisioned already for in-building connectivity. It's just so crucially important. And we've looked at all of our old buildings. One of the things we found is that most of them were already sort of overwired for old sort of telephone service. And we've pulled all of that out. We didn't bother auditing it. We just said scrape it. And we're using the same conduit to deploy our DAS systems. And one of the things we found is that actually, again, then this gets back to the idea of master planning this stuff. And yes, not every individual building owner has the opportunity to do it, but when you look at larger scale complexes and also the rise of edge data centers, and I know I harp on these a lot in the conversation, but I think they're just they're a crucial component of the network topology that we're talking about, but it's something that, and it's also an intersection of real estate and technology, but it's sort of ignored in some ways in that for us to actually bring our DAS installations, and Jeff will know all about this, in all these buildings much more easily and efficiently, we can put the head end in our edge data center. We can have all the sort of the brain, the equipment live in there, and treat that as a telecom room for an entire neighborhood. And then we basically bring from there all of the antennas into the buildings and we deploy that. That's a much, much, much easier thing to do. That's like us extending a Wi-Fi network, but to Jeff's point, it's much more reliable, secure, easy to manage. There's all these benefits. And we're bringing that through all of the buildings and making sure that robust in-building connectivity is a feature across all of National Landing. We don't want to deploy 5G for it to be outside in a park as a demonstration case. That's not that exciting. It has to be in the apartments. It has to be in the offices. It has to propagate. And if it does that, that opens up the potential for extraordinary private network use cases. And I think, Wanda, you really hit on this, but the notion that if someone, and this is the use case we envision, and if someone comes to us and says, hey, I'm working at, Wanda Gibson Enterprises, and that's located at the 10th floor of a JBG Smith building. When you hire your employee, their credential on their phone turns on for their apartment that they can lease in the neighborhood. They can be in that apartment on your network without having to be on a VPN. And when they're in National Landing, whether they're at a cafe, in their apartment, working out at the gym, they can have that secure connectivity. And when they leave, that SIM basically switches them off of that networking. They go roam back onto whatever carrier they're working with. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time with AT&T on. It's the idea of creating that seamless connectivity where you say, because I have that connection everywhere, because everything's sensorized, my parking, my apartment, my gym membership, everything runs through that digital credential, which lets us manage things better, to your point about the freezers during the pandemic, but it also adds new layers of security for big enterprise users. It adds new layers of ability to manage their users and their network because it can be running on this. And we know that it's distributed universally through the buildings. And that gets back to the digital divide question, where you could say, and this is a conversation Jack Belcher and I have all the time, it's like, well, how does the county leverage something like that? Not only for digital divide questions where, Wanda, again, you nailed this one with like getting devices into the hands of the devices are there, making sure the devices can get on the network that we've distributed through buildings that propagates better, where there's a way we can look at buildings, when we think about the affordable housing units that we control, how do we make sure they're treated the same way from a connectivity perspective as market rate units? That's very important because it allows the government to then step in and do what the government does best. And so I think when we look at this across the board, we say we need to make sure it gets in all the buildings, it addresses some of those questions. And it even, the last point I'll make is there's the safety and security application. And one thing we spent a lot of time with Arlington on, and I think I'm sure you're doing the same thing in Prince George's County, is just thinking about how do we track first responders through buildings? Because if you have a DAS system in a building and you've got internal connectivity, there's a lot of really cool things you can do to make sure that firefighters, police officers, other first responders are healthy and safe, and you can track them through the building that's otherwise, covered in smoke or is, experiencing, God forbid, an active shooter situation. It gives people much more visibility because all of our sensors are then working to make sure that those first responders are tracked and that they can see, even as simple as something like where we're uploading our building plans, you can hold up a device and use augmented reality via this connectivity to see through walls, to understand, hey, I need to get from here to here. How can I get there and do my job? Those are the kinds of advances that this allows if you get it in the buildings.
Right. Absolutely. And that's one of the things that first responders came to CIOs. We were discovered after 9/11 and had been talking about in terms of that very thing. That is one of the most critical use cases ever. Just think about a firefighter in a building they can't see. okay, but the technology would enable them to have eyes and kind of know where they're going. All of these building plans and all these things in paper, somewhere, or for them to be right there available so that first responders can safely do their job, as well as basically kind of having a more global view of what they're into. My colleague Jack Belcher has been a key spokesperson on this issue. Obviously, 9/11 happened in Arlington County, where the Pentagon is located. And it's one of the things that we started with the baby steps of, kind of tying our networks together so that basically firefighters and then their support functions can also kind of communicate while they're in these kind of roles and whatever. And so this is a continued advancement down that road, but that is absolutely a critical factor that we are very concerned about in law enforcement and firefighting in the community.
Terrific. So just wanted to welcome everyone on the call to submit any questions that you may have through the Q&A. Happy to open up the questions more broadly. I can maybe kick us off. I don't see any in the queue right now, but there is one that I did want to sort of circle back on this topic around social equity. We've talked a lot about infrastructure that's needed to close digital divide. We've talked, I think, a bit about devices. Would love to get the panel's perspectives on other investments that are really needed to actually close the digital divide, to drive inclusive growth, to help folks that are unfortunately on the wrong side of the divide today.
I can start with this, and I'm probably the worst qualified person on the call to answer this, but I think from an outsider's perspective, what I see is we're all excited about this because this represents, the fourth industrial revolution. This is exciting. Like this blend of the physical and the digital, this is only going to expand over the next decade. And I think, one of my colleagues, Adam Rashid, who wasn't able to join, he's really the co-head of the Smart City Initiative and a lot of the brains behind the work we're doing here. Adam will say to me all the time, well, think about like Uber, Uber wasn't possible without 4G, without LTE. Like that use case, that business is massive. Think about Snapchat, Instagram, many of these things we take for granted on our phones. These things didn't exist. That drove massive amount of economic growth. Well, guess what? Not everyone is equipped to participate and enjoy that economic growth. And so if we do think that this is as transformative as all of us think it is, I think that gets back to things like credentialing and training programs, things like, I'll cross over, but just to say, Greater Washington Partnership is doing a lot with the Capital CoLab, and there are other efforts like that. I think we need as a group to say, if we believe this is as impactful as we think it is, credentialing and training and giving people the tools that they need to participate and enjoy this so that it isn't just an industrial revolution like every other one they've seen that's disadvantages massive groups of people, but instead lifts up a lot of folks. You need to be able to give them the toolkit that they need to participate in this change that's coming. That's, I think, the biggest imperative here more than anything else around a device.
Thank you.
One of the resources that counties do provide, and Prince George is doing so, is the opportunity for training. So oftentimes, people may have been handed a device to use or whatever, but they really just don't have the knowledge at that point in time in order to leverage and use those devices. So there's programs like resources like that. Obviously in youth and employment, there are resources that are provided through the county to basically help people be able to become more digitally aware and knowledge, and to know how to basically kind of seek employment opportunities better through some of that education, as well as some of the other programs to help get people out there and get them ready for the digital age. And so those are some of the additional kinds of things, Danielle, that the counties are kind of working toward, basically kind of hit that digital equity. And the other piece of this has to do with what people, and I'm going to say this whole idea of affordability, where on a panel, one person said even if it was available for $1, some people may not be takers. Well, I just want to say this, okay? Basically, it's a utility. It's an essential utility to life. So I left the NACO conference with this in mind. They picked it up. Today, in today's world, you're not going to, have a house like approved for occupancy without water and electricity in it. And so I will say, the goal is this whole idea of connectedness is a utility essential to life. Period. So I'm hoping in terms of like that part of it, which is not the technical part that I do, but it certainly is an enabler to be sure that basically all of this comes together in terms of a new society.
Thank you so much. We have another question that's come in. I'll just read it aloud. How do we address cybersecurity concerns if using digital tags to track users from one network to another? We've seen lately that hackers can cripple infrastructure in private networks.
Okay, I guess the CIO will take that one. Obviously, all of the public officials are extremely concerned about this whole idea of ransomwares and this hacking and identity theft, all these kinds of things that basically would make people concerned in terms of using digital assets. So I don't look at it as a separate thing, like it's over here. Okay, it's part of everything going forward that's going to happen. The securing of the infrastructures, the securing of the devices, the way that basically people can have a better assurance. Now, of course, every second, a moment of the day, there's hackers somewhere around the world getting in. I mean, this is what they do. This is what they set up for. That's why this digital defense is something that is important. It's critical. Looking for leadership all the way from the federal government down. This county, we're investing in cybersecurity so people have more confidence in what we do for them. I mean, obviously, when we work with our citizenry, we have data. That is their data, and they expect that it's held in as safe as possible. And so that is something that all of the county governments. There is a Chief Information Security Officers Committee of the National Capital Region. Has been very active, and basically it's always looking at the next best practices. So it's not just the technology itself; it's behaviors and protocols and all of that, which is the way that this whole thing becomes more protective. But it's something that is the way the world is. It's not a one-time event. It's not a separate thing. It's basically got to be laced into every fabric in terms of how we support services in the world.
Great. Maybe one additional question. We've talked a bit about smart cities. We've talked a bit about smart health, but I'd love to pose to the panel, are there other IoT or 5G use cases that you are particularly excited about for the DMV?
I can take that initially. I would say, there's a couple of things we skimmed earlier, but connected autonomous vehicles, that's a huge item. I mean, traffic in the DMV area is not ideal. There's a lot of really great research centers, higher ed centers that are focusing on this. So, Virginia Tech is at the forefront of autonomous research. University of Maryland has a center for autonomous vehicles. Great aerospace programs as well that bleed into that. I would say, that's a technology space that I'm really excited about. And I think that there's some pilots going on. There are some pilots going on within the Maryland area. I think it was last month, there was a report that came out from the state of Maryland, kind of their vision cast for connected autonomous vehicles. And that also kind of comes down to, how do we, as industry and government, reduce some of the kind of barriers to letting these sorts of new innovations take seed and really kind of grow and become adopted. I think it is something that will happen organically, but when you talk about life and safety, you need to have some sort of oversight to it. So ways to collaborate, national landings, to me sounds like a fantastic area to start researching and piloting these sorts of connected autonomous vehicle solutions within kind of a more private domain, but that will ultimately scale out into public roads and areas like 95, 495, et cetera.
Yeah, I think, Jeff, you make a great point, and we've spent a lot of time with Virginia Tech and VTTI. Their Transportation Institute is a leader in autonomous vehicles and research, and they've been a foundational part of everything we've done to date with Smart City, because you're right, but everything does require, and I know I say this again and again, I think the Board of Trade and Connected DMV have both been fantastic about looking at this stuff. It's like, it's got to be public and private. You can't do it exclusively privately or exclusively publicly. It'll fail because the public can't do it without the private landowners, because deploying this stuff is really hard. You can do it in a limited way, and the private can't do it. I could have never done what we're doing without the support of Arlington County, because Arlington County's been very engaged on this kind of thing. And when we think about autonomous vehicle testing, great, we have Virginia Tech is here. Some of the roads are public, some of the roads are private, and ultimately all of them are governed and regulated in any way by the county. If we want to do this, we have to say, hey, we want to do innovation here, want to have an innovation overlay. We have to make something like that happen. And I think that's important. But I would say that even beyond that, my view on this from a DC region perspective is that, look, I think there's a huge component of this that gets back to the cybersecurity question that also is a policy question. Like, we have a unique advantage here. We're not only the third largest tech workforce in the country, we also have we're the seat of the federal government. And I know that's very common, but that doesn't just mean regulation of companies. It also means, some of the mandates the federal government has to deal with things like cybersecurity, which has become increasingly important, and also cyber warfare. And if you just look, we're sitting in National Landing adjacent to the Pentagon. This is a massive national defense priority. This is a massive national competitiveness priority. If you look at the press release we put out around it, Senator Warner found it interesting enough to comment on that, and is in the press release because he understands the great power competition, national security implications. I think as we look at the technologies that are developed here, not only figuring out how to do it, but what to run on it, how to do it well, gets to global competitiveness and national security. So that's ultimately where I think there's a unique advantage of being not only a place where 70% of the world's internet traffic is passing through Ashburn, 70% or more, but also the fact that you've got everyone who's focused on our national defense and security right here.
Thank you so much. This has been a terrific panel. Let me kick it back to George for closing remarks. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, I think you can hear me. I'm not able to get my video back on. I'm going to give it another try. I'm the weak link here, obviously. Danielle, thank you for facilitating this discussion, and for McKinsey's data and that led everything that we talked about. Jeff, Evan, and Wanda, thank you for taking time to speak with us. We truly appreciate it. This is a very informative discussion. We appreciate the insights, and thank Crown Castle for their series sponsorship. And of course, once again, McKinsey and APCO in some of the other facets of the discussion. Today's briefing will be available later on the website, and stay well, everyone, and have a great day. Thanks again to all.
Thank you.